Hey folks! Welcome to Riffs with Mark. My name is Mark Cruz. Today we are going to be going over dominant 7 arpeggios and how to use those in improvisation. This is the 6th lesson in this course, I believe, and this is a course that is primarily targeted at learning improvisation, really encouraging the idea of picking up the guitar and just making stuff up, you know? Whether that's playing on your own or playing with recordings, it's just a whole lot of fun. It's my favorite part of playing the guitar. I love picking up the instrument, putting on a recording. I have a groove work playlist that I work from almost every day that's just on Spotify, and I just put on a song, whether it's Dennis Chambers, James Brown, whoever, and I love just playing along with recordings, and a lot of the time when I do that, I make stuff up. So what we've looked at so far is we've looked at the major pentatonic scale, which is like this, is the C major pentatonic scale. Only we've thrown in that blue note as well. We've looked at the C minor pentatonic scale, or C blues scale, which is also very, very fun. We've looked at the borrowing from the Mixolydian mode, taking that major pentatonic scale and putting in a flat 7. Not quite the true Mixolydian mode, but maybe a little bit better for improvisation. We've looked at the Dorian mode. I believe that was our last lesson, which is also a great scale for improvisation. And this week, what we're doing is we're taking a look at dominant 7 arpeggios. Now, dominant 7 arpeggio is a fancy way of saying, or a dominant 7 chord is what we should start with. If I say G dominant 7, that's a fancy way of saying G7. So that might have been one of the first chords that you ever learned, a G7 chord, that open chord shape. Or I remember the first day that I played guitar, I spent an hour just trying to switch between a D chord and an A7 chord, all right? And just going back and forth. So that A7 chord, when you see a chord that says the letter, like A, and then just the number 7, that is a dominant 7 chord. You'll also see things like a minor 7 chord, things like a major 7 chord. That's not what we're looking at today. We're looking at dominant 7 chords. Now, what is a dominant 7 chord? You may have heard that your normal triad, I'll take a regular C major chord, that chord, but we're going to do it broken up like a C, an E, and a G. That makes a C major chord. If you play this chord, every single note in that chord is either a C, an E, or a G. See, it's C, E, G. Oh, there's another C, there's another E. Some of you might play it like that, and that's a G on top. So you have what we call a 1, a 3, and a 5 of a major chord. 1, 3, and 5. Well, what we do to make a dominant 7 chord is we put a flat 7 on top, okay? And a flat 7 is the interval of a minor 7 up from the root note. Or, this is maybe an easier way to think about it, a flat 7 is a whole step down from the root note. So in the case of C major, if we take a C major chord and we want to make it into a C7 chord, we put a B flat in it. We would go C, E, G, C, up there, that would be our root note. Well, we'll go a whole step down, and we would probably play it like that. And those are the notes of our C7 chord. It's C, E, G, and B flat. So it looks like that when you play it. Another way that people will play it is like that, or you know, you get the idea. Many different ways to play the same chord on the guitar. So what we're going to look at today is we'll look at arpeggios. And all that means is taking that chord, or any chord for that matter, and playing each note individually. Instead of playing all the notes together like this, we take the notes and we play them. And that's a sound that you've heard. You've definitely heard people arpeggiating chords. That was a minor 7 arpeggio, for example, but this is a C7 arpeggio. And as far as that sound goes, Chris, if you want to, I'm not sure if you have this up already, but go ahead and put up figure 1.1 through 1.5. And I'm just going to play through these. This is actually several different ways to play the same thing. And this is the way that I always, for any interval or any chord, I often have something that I think of to relate, like a song that I relate to the way a fourth sounds. A lot of people will go, okay, like a fourth, this interval. That's the interval of a fourth right there. It's 4 notes in a scale. I'm playing B up to E in that case. And a lot of people go, here comes the bride. And they think, oh, that's what a fourth sounds like. For like a major sixth, that's the interval of a major sixth. I'm playing D up to B. A lot of people think of the NBC chimes. So having things like that is very, very helpful, because when you need to figure out what a major sixth sounds like, you think of, oh, the NBC chimes. And you know what a major sixth sounds like right there. But anyway, what I use for a dominant 7th chord is this. That is, the bass line that was used a lot in the 50s. And also just about every rockabilly song that you ever heard. If you're not familiar with the term rockabilly, we're talking about like Brian Setzer Orchestra, that kind of thing. You've heard that before. That outlines a dominant 7th chord. That's what's happening there. It is a dominant 7 arpeggio. It has the 6th thrown in there. And if you look at figure 1.1, we're going to do that in C. And the purpose of doing this is, one, I want you to hear what a dominant 7th arpeggio sounds like. So that's it. It does have the 6th in there, and that's the 7th fret of the D string. So that note is not technically in the chord. It's really just that. And so that's what it sounds like. That's what all of these are going to sound like. But also, I want you to see what it looks like. I want you to see what it looks like in different places in the scale, in the arpeggio. So that's one in figure 1.1. You'll see that all the time, that shape right there with that sound. So get that under your fingers, ingrain that in your head as that's a dominant 7 arpeggio. When you hear that, you go, that's a dominant 7 arpeggio, starting on the root note, with a 6th added in there, but it's fine. It's just fine. So there's figure 1.1. If we take a look at 1.2, that's going to look exactly the same, okay? Sounds the same as well, but it's with the root note on the A string. Take a look at figure 1.3. This is a little bit different. And I guess I should mention, Chris, this, I don't know if it's easy for you. Chris is our jam play mediator, I guess you would call him. Chris is today. But Chris, I don't know if it's easy for you to bring up that major pentatonic / blues scale with the added flat 7 scale shapes. If you're able to easily put that on the screen, that's helpful. We use that when we were looking at the Mixolydian mode. And it's helpful for you to relate these arpeggios to the position that you're playing them in. And for like the major pentatonic scales, this one in 1.3, this would be in position 1, as would be figure 1.1, but go. And hopefully you can see where that is in the scale shape. It's right there. And Chris, just so you know, that you can probably take that, do whatever you want. You can leave it up, you can take it down. I'm not sure if you're able to keep both of these things up on the screen or not. But if we move on to 1.4, that's going to be in position 5 of those scale shapes. So, and that's not just like, well, we'll talk a little bit about whether you want to look at these as arpeggios or if you want to look at them within the scale in just a second. But just know these shapes are all, if you start using a lot of dominant seventh chords, you're going to see these shapes all over the place, just all over the place. And you might be able to tell I get kind of excited about them because I use dominant seven chords in my improvisation all the time. I absolutely love them. And then finally, if you want to take a look at 1.1, I didn't give this one, I'm sorry, 1.5, I didn't completely give this one away. I just gave you the start of it, okay? This is just the start of 1.5. And I'll go ahead and play the rest, but you got to figure out the rest by ear, okay? And that's in position 5, but it's down the octave. So the one way we played it in position 5, this is, you figure out the rest. You use your ear and everything. So that's the way that dominant seventh chords sound. That's the way they look at different places in the scale. Now, Chris, if you don't mind taking, putting up the dominant seventh arpeggio shapes, if you don't mind putting that on the screen. And let's take a look at that for a minute. These really are the dominant seventh arpeggio shapes that I use. But I've been using them for, I don't know, I probably got into dominant seventh arpeggios 15 years ago, and I don't think I'd ever seen them actually diagrammed out, okay? I don't think I'd ever taken them and diagrammed them out. I think I learned them by musical notation, just finding the different shapes on the guitar. If you see these diagrams and you feel intimidated because they look, I think they look confusing as can be. Like, don't get me wrong, but these are really good shapes. Like, that's all I can say. If they look confusing, if they look terrifying, don't worry. If you take them and you look at them right next to those scale shapes that Chris had on the screen of the major pentatonic scale with the added flat 7, you can see them right there in the scale shape. I promise. They're right there in the scale shape, and the positions line up. Position 1 will fall right into position 1 of the scale shape. Position 2 will fall right into position 2 of the scale shape. But man, when you just take the 1, the 3, and the flat 7, it looks crazy. It really does. But I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to play through them. I'm going to use the key of C major. We're primarily in this lesson going to just use C major and some other surrounding arpeggios like G7 and F7. But it's just, things can get complicated really fast when you're looking at changing arpeggio shapes, because then you ask yourself, are we also changing the scale? I don't know. But that might be a question for a later lesson. So if we take a look at position 1 in C major, it's going to start on the 8th fret in C major. Of course, you could play this scale, this shape anywhere, because that's the whole idea with scale shapes, is you can move them around. So this one goes like this. I'll play that slowly. Start on the 8th fret of the lowest string, 7th fret of the A string, 10th fret of the A string, 8th fret of the D, 10th fret of the D, 3rd fret of the G, I'm sorry, no, 9th fret of the G, don't know where that, oh, it was the 3rd note of the scale, sorry. 8th fret of the B string, 11th fret of the B string, that's the B flat, that's the flat 7. And then you have your root note again up here on the high E string. Always take note of your root notes anytime you're doing anything. So root note, and I'm going to bring it back down to the B flat on the 11th fret. The G on the 8th fret, that's the 5th. 9th fret of the G string, that's the 3rd of the arpeggio. Root note, that's the 10th fret of the D string. 8th fret of the D string, that's the flat 7, the B flat. The 10th fret of the A. 7th fret of the A string. And then once again, the low E string at the 8th fret. I'm not going to do that with every arpeggio because we've got a lot to get through. But take a second and make sure you can play that. This is, I don't know that I'm going to say this is definitely the most common dominant 7th arpeggio shape. It's a nice one though. Can you see the outline of your C major bar chord there? Can you see that in the shape, that E bar chord shape? Can you see that in that arpeggio diagram there? Because it's in there. And likewise, if you know this dominant 7, C7 arpeggio or chord shape, you'll see that in there as well, right there. It's all a matter of finding things relative to one another. So that's position 1. I won't take as much time on the other ones, but if we go up to position 2, you don't get a root note until you get to the D string there. And to be completely honest, this is kind of a tough one. Oh, it's not too bad though. So that's position 2, position 3. I really like this one. I like that it starts on the 3rd down there and then you got the root note right there. I'm sorry, I should play that a little more slow. Position 4, let's go ahead and drop this an octave, shall we? We're gonna take it and I'll play it up here first, position 4. This is probably the hardest one, and it's because of this flat 7 down here, and then you got to go up to root note like that. You see how I'm shifting like that? It's not my favorite in that way. In fact, I just don't use the lower part of this very much in my improvisation. But if you want to learn to play them, and you want it to coincide with the pentatonic fingerings that you know, that's kind of the way to do it. The other way to do it is to actually put this low flat 7 and to put it right there. When I was making the diagrams, I almost put that note right there. In this case, it's the 1st fret of the 5th string. So instead of like that, it's like that. I'm sure some of you are at home going, why didn't you do that, Mark? And it's because it was to coincide with the major pentatonic diagrams. And it's honestly, that's the way I know the arpeggio. That's the way I've always played it. Doesn't mean it's the best way to do it. If we take a look at position 5, and so I should clarify with that, if you want to play that flat 7 there, be my guest. That's perfectly fine. It would be more like this. This is position 4 again. Instead of like that. So up to position 5. This one actually starts on the flat 7. But to really get it in your head, it can sound really confusing if you just start on the flat 7. So hear that root note first. In this case, it's on the 8th fret of the low E string. And since this is position 5, you all know that position 5 is sort of my favorite of the major pentatonic scale. Like, I really, really like, in C major, I like this. I really like this one, so this would be the one that kind of coincides with that. I would say that of these, position 5 and position 1 are probably going to be the most valuable. Although we've got one riff today that I think really centers around position 2 of these arpeggios. So I'll see if I remember to bring that up when we do this. So one thing, and we really should get into the riffs. I had definitely planned on doing more teaching today versus riffs, because dominant 7 arpeggios are a concept as much as they are, riffs. So it's definitely important to go over some things. In fact, if you want to send Chris some questions at this point, let me know if you have any questions, and maybe we'll take a moment to answer questions before we hop into the riffs. Just let me know. And if you don't, we'll just continue onward. But I do want to give you a little bit of a flavor of what this sounds like improvising with them because there are a lot of different ways that you can use them. There are a lot of different ways you can think of them. If you look at the key of C major, or if you look at any key for that matter, and you just build seventh chords off of every chord, off of every note of the scale, you'll actually only get, if you stay in the major scale, which we're not doing, but if you stay in the major scale, you actually only end up with one dominant seventh chord in a key. And in the key of C major, that's a G7. So that seems really, really weird, but we're going to break out of that. The thing is that we've primarily been looking at using one scale to solo over an entire song. Maybe switching back and forth between the major pentatonic and the minor pentatonic scale, which is a bear in itself. I mean, we haven't even really talked about that in depth, but know that when you switch arpeggios, like if you're over a C7 chord or something like that, you've got a C7 chord, well, you can play the C major pentatonic scale. You can play the C minor pentatonic scale. And you can play a C7 arpeggio. But as far as major 7 arpeggios go, that's about all you can do. Like, you're over that C7 7 chord, you don't want to play another major dominant 7 arpeggio, if you catch my drift. Like, if you're going to use arpeggios, you kind of want to know what chord you're playing them over. So if you're coming along playing a C7 arpeggio over a C7 chord, and then we're going to switch to an F7, like in a 12-bar blues, which I'll show you in a minute, you're probably going to want to switch to an F7 arpeggio. So you can maybe see how this would get a little complicated pretty quickly, and that's the entire genre of jazz. Like, if you've ever wondered what jazz is like, jazz is oftentimes changing keys every couple measures, sometimes every measure, sometimes every beat. And you're not really changing keys because you're not changing the tonal center. You can still hear like the root note of the song within it. But you can oftentimes in jazz, or I should say it's very rare in jazz, that you can use the same scale throughout the entire song. That's very, very rare. So that's where arpeggios are really, really great in jazz, because I think it's easier to change to a different arpeggio than it is to change to an entirely different scale and really hit those correct tones. So I'm going to show you what this sounds like a little bit, and then we'll get into the riffs. So I'm going to use the Jam Play 12-bar blues in C jam track for this, and I'll try to make note of what arpeggios I'm using, but I will be changing arpeggios, and that's not something I'm expecting you to do after this lesson. Maybe a little bit, like changing from C to an F arpeggio without going, okay, here's a C arpeggio, here's an F arpeggio, without having to make that shift. If you can say, okay, here's a C7 arpeggio, or the outline to it, and then you go, okay, now here's the F7 arpeggio. That's a pretty decent goal. But it's okay if that's like way over your head. That's all right. It's perfectly fine. There aren't a ton of genres you have to do that in. But I'll kind of show you what I'm talking about. So I'll start with the C7. So that was C. Now I'll go to F. Back to C. To G. I'll do one more time through. So C. And now to F. Now I threw some other notes in the scale in there, even outside of the scale. To G. And And of course, I traveled outside of the arpeggios a little bit, but I'm thinking in arpeggios. I'm going, okay, here is a C arpeggio, and then I'm throwing in notes around it like a scale, but not as strict as a scale. And that's what I really, really like about arpeggios versus a scale, is a lot of the time, when you play a scale, it sounds like you're playing a scale. Like, that's the issue with learning to improvise based on scales. These major pentatonic, minor pentatonic scales, those are great because I don't think you really sound like you're playing a scale. Like, I really, really don't. I feel like if you play a minor pentatonic scale in a sequence and you go, I mean, I just played a pattern, basically. Just the descending scale and a few notes doubling back. I don't feel like that sounds like a scale. I think it sounds awesome. But if I go and I just play a C major scale, it sounds like I'm playing a scale. It sounds like I'm playing a C major scale. With the arpeggios, what's really cool about them is if you throw in notes around if we consider the notes that are in the arpeggio to be like the juicy, good chord tones, we call those the target tones, and we throw in notes around those, and then we land on them. It's like we use notes of the scale without playing the scale, and we really just end up, it's a good way to you almost trick your fingers into playing the really good tones, if that makes sense. But it, of course, takes practice and experience and trying things. Some things sound bad, and then you don't do those anymore. A lot of this is trial and error. That's going to be a lot of your playing forever. You know, I've certainly found that in my own playing after doing this for a while. So let's go ahead and move on to riffs. We've got about a little over a half hour left, and I don't know that we'll get through all of them, but because we've got quite a few here, but let's at least get to a few of them. So the very first one that we're going to do, we're calling it Riff 2, and that's figure 2.1, if we take a look at that. And it's this is going to be in position 5 in C major, so that's this arpeggio, or this scale shape if we're using the major pentatonic scale, with the flat 7, kind of like the mixolydian mode. If you want to always think of your dominant 7 arpeggios as matching up with the mixolydian mode, that's a really good way to think of it. Your dominant 7th chord is right there in the corresponding mixolydian mode. So like C7 arpeggio is right there in the C mixolydian mode, okay? F7 is right there in the F mixolydian mode. So that's a good thing to know. And that's sort of what we're doing here, is we're combining scale and arpeggio, but primarily arpeggio, okay? I'll go ahead and play it for you. It's a little bit rhythmic. Pay attention to those staccato notes. So we start on the root note up here, right? Okay, because our arpeggio is like this. Remember, it's position 5. This little trill here, that is the 6th note of the scale to the flat 7. And then we do a blue note, and all right, I know that in this shape we play the blue note there. In this case, it's best to do it right there. No hard and fast rules, really. So slide from that 4, that 4th fret to the 5th fret. And then we do flat 7 down to the 6. Come back to the 5th fret of the scale, or I'm sorry, 5th fret of the string, the D string. Hammer on to the 7th fret. 6th fret to the 7th fret. And that's riff. That is what we're calling riff 1. Now we're going to do a variation of that here, and we're going to go. that's, again, starting in position 5, but instead of doing that blue note here, we're going to do the blue note here like we were probably supposed to. And we're going to slide up to position 1. Hey, Chris, if you don't mind sending me just a Skype message real quick, Chris, and just make sure the feed is still going. Let me know if we have any questions, too. And sorry, this is 2.2 here. So once again, this is this here, if we're looking at the second measure, that is the 6 trill up to the flat 7 like we did here. We're doing it down an octave here. And this is kind of a cool alternate ending there. Chris, go ahead and send me those questions if you would. Thank you, man. What we're doing there is we're once again doing blue note, that flat third, up into the natural third. And then this is probably my favorite interval in the world. It's the interval of a minor 6. I shouldn't say it's my favorite in the world, but I really, really love the interval of a 6. I really, really love that. But it's the third up to the root note, and then down to the flat 7. And that's figure 2.2. Let's see. I am going to take a look at these questions real quick and just make sure I don't glance over them. Okay, all right. So this is a very good question here and this one is: do you recommend practicing these arpeggios with a metronome in addition to the riffs? So yes, yeah, I think practicing the arpeggios is really, really fantastic. I've told you that with some of these scales that it's less important to practice the scale than it is to practice improvising with it. With the arpeggios, yeah, I think practicing the arpeggios is a great idea. I did a lot of this earlier this summer, right when COVID hit. I got into a very like electric guitar oriented just practice phase, like doing exercises for the sake of doing exercises and going in with the metronome. So every few years I do this, something like it. And I chose dominant 7 arpeggios. So what I did was I did these 5 shapes and I played them as is. But what I would suggest doing with the practice is, instead of just playing the shapes, which is fine. I shouldn't say instead of, I think in addition to, try to make up patterns with them. Go like, and I'll use like scale degrees here, 1, 3, 5, 7. Like go 1, 3, 5, 7, 3, 5, 7, 1, 5, 7, 1, 3. Does that make sense? And then it's also really great if you want a real challenge. Take a chord progression and outline the chords of the chord progression as you're going. And switch arpeggios. Oh, like no matter where you are in the arpeggio, switch to the other arpeggio. That can be really, really good practice. Like if we outline a 12-bar blues, and I might be setting myself up for failure here. I haven't practiced in a while. If we do a 12-bar blues in C though, and we go, okay, C7, F, C, G, and I didn't actually do a 12-bar blues. I did more of a bluegrass progression, but hopefully that makes a little bit of sense there. That kind of thing, and doing it with a metronome so that you're having to do it right on the beat, it's really, really good for both your learning the arpeggio shapes, your dexterity of your left hand and right hand for that matter, and getting an ear for what you're doing and learning where they are on the guitar. It's super good for you. One more question. Should we be using alternate picking when playing the arpeggios? I know sweeping them is a popular technique. Oh yes. If you if you're good at sweeping, awesome. But I would say probably primarily alternate pick them. There's one arpeggio of these that I think actually works really well on a sweep, if you're into that. And off the top of my head, I need to actually look at the diagram to tell you which one it is. I used it in a riff. It's position 3. And it's not like a full sweep. If I do it in C, it'd be right. And I think the way to do it is to do it in triplets. Wait. Gosh, I know there's a decent way to do it. But long answer short, because I can't seem to make it work right now. I am not a sweep picker. I'm really not. Alternate pick them. Primarily alternate pick them. Sweep picking, I think, should primarily be used for arpeggios that are one note per string. Like, for example, which that's just a regular C major arpeggio, okay? That's not a C7 arpeggio. If you can't play at one note per string, I think it's very hard to sweep, just in my opinion. But I think it's all very hard to sweep. I'm not an expert sweep picker. No, I'm really not. But I recommend alternate picking these. Good questions, both of those. And if anybody else has questions, please let us know. Let us know. This can be very, very confusing stuff here. So if we take a look at 3.1, this is going to be the one that I mentioned earlier, and it starts in position 2 and then goes up to position 3. And one thing that's cool about position 2, both position 2 and position 3 start on the 3rd note of the scale of the arpeggio. And this is 3.1, and this is a G7 arpeggio. So like that would be position 1, but this is going to be up here. And I didn't put a slide into that 3rd note, but you should totally slide into that 3rd note. You'll have much more fun, I promise. And I really recommend doing as much of that kind of articulation as you can with these, because making your improvisation sound like an arpeggio is only a little bit better than making your improvisation sound like a scale. You don't really want it to just sound like you're going, you don't really want that sound, but you just want to utilize it. So when you put in those slides, it makes it sound so much cooler. And when you do things like doubling back, that kind of helps to make it a little more musical. Because it's all just tools, scales, arpeggios, they're all just tools. It's really up to you to make it music. So start on that 7th fret of the low E, come up, and then you slide up, and that's coming up to position 3. And then you double back, and position 3 is of course the one that looks like this. Position 2 is the one that looks like this. And you can see how they run into each other. I didn't double back that time. But we'll move on to position 3.2, or sorry, figure 3.2, and that goes. And this is kind of cool because we're going to go all the way up to position 5, or position 4 and 5. So that doesn't involve a lot of doubling back, and we get an entire 3 octaves, which, you know, if you're going for octaves, that's like a party trick right there. I really like that, actually. Like, I really like the way that sounds. I definitely find they sound less like arpeggios. They sound less like a technical exercise when you start on a note that isn't the root note. It also makes them a little more difficult because it's a little harder to tell where you are if you're not starting on the root note. But I think that actually sounds like a pretty, you know, that sounds pretty cool. And, you know, I mean, it's just like, it's not even anything too special. You're really just playing the arpeggio with some slides. I'm definitely going to use that in my improv. So I'm going to tell you the position that you're in as I shift them. Position 2. Position 3, position 4, so that's this one. That actually really outlines your G7 bar chord shape, this, with a flat 7 up there. Do you see that right in there? So, right there. G7 bar chord shape, you can see all those notes in there. And then it ends in position 5, but it's really right at the end. And so that can kind of bring you into a good spot there. So, and I think I did one more item with this, and 3.3, and this is kind of like what we were talking about earlier about using when you practice them, making a pattern with them that kind of doubles back. And that's what this one does. It goes. I should have written that a little bit differently. I think I would have gone. I like that a little bit better. It was only the ending that I changed. And I'm sorry, I'm just thinking out loud there. So what I'm doing is I'm just doubling back. I'm playing 4 notes. 1 or 3, 5, 7, 1. 3, 5, 7, 1. And I'm saying that like the chord degree, the scale degrees, the notes of the chords, the number of the chords, 3, the third note of the chord, 3, 5, 7, 1. Doubling back to the flat 7, 7, 1, up to 3, 5. Doubling back to the third. Once again, doubling back to the 7th. That's the 10th fret of the 3rd string. Slide up. This is actually one I'd need to take a second to really get this under my fingers to be able to play it fast. But that's how you do it right there. And what's cool about that, notice that riff, it spans the same amount of space as the one before, right? Like or it spans the same 3 octaves as the one before. We didn't go like from here up to here. We went from here to here on the fingerboard, just like the last one, but it lasted longer. It was a 3-measure riff instead of a 2-measure riff. And that's something I'd have you pay attention to. That's what doubling back with your patterns can do, is it can make the riff last a little bit longer. If it's something where you need to draw it out, if you know you've got a little more time. And I'm not, in improvisation, I'm not necessarily going, oh, I'm gonna need 2 measures of this riff. I better double back on my notes. But I might go, oh, I want this to go on a little bit longer. So maybe I would choose to, instead of just going, maybe to go something like that. And I was using notes of the scale. I wasn't just using the arpeggio there. But you saw how that was drawn out a little bit more. And that's the difference between figure 3.3 and figure 3.2. It's all just a matter of where you want to use them. So if we move on to figure 4.1, this, if you look at it, if you look at the tab, it looks like an absolute mess, okay? It looks crazy. It's not, though. It's actually a super easy concept. And I'm not really a country picker, okay? I grew up in Michigan. We didn't really, I didn't grow up on country music, but I've learned a little bit of chicken picking. And one technique that I've seen some guys use that I've noticed, because you watch some of these guys like Brent Mason, Andy Wood, just amazing chicken pickers. They're so good. It's incredible. And as a guy who doesn't do a lot of country picking, or who didn't for a long time, I go, wow, like, oh my gosh, like what is he even doing? But one thing that I've seen some guys do, and we did this in jazz a little bit too when I used to play some jazz, is to take a note of the chord and you take a note that's a half step below, and you just alternate between the note of the chord and the notes that's a half step below, and that's what we're doing in this riff. And what you do is note of the chord, note a half step below, back to the note of the chord. Then you go to the note that's a half step below the next chord tone, and then you do the same thing with the next chord tone. So 1. And I just did that with 1 octave of a C7 arpeggio. Now, you don't want to do this with everything, okay? I mean, that's a very, very characteristic, incredibly chromatic sound. And when I say chromatic, I mean just all of the notes of the chromatic scale, you know? But what you're doing is you're making it very chromatic, but you're targeting those chord tones. I remember one of the first jazz riffs that I played, because when I went to jazz school, I had the hardest time getting my stuff to sound like jazz because I wanted to just play within the scale. And then I found one day, gosh, if I just go like that, all I did was take a C major arpeggio or a C major chord, and I just played a note below each chord tone before hitting the chord tone, and I was like, wow, you know, because I'm not thinking, oh, that's an F sharp into a G, that's a B into a C, that's an E flat into an E. I was just looking at the arpeggio. And it's like, it's a very, very easy, simple technique. So that's kind of what I'm doing in 4.1, only we're going chord tone, non-chord tone, back to chord tone. To a leading tone, back to the leading tone, now to the next leading tone. So I'm going 1 of the chord, lead to the 3 of the chord, lead to the 5 of the chord, lead to the 7 of the chord, lead to the root note. So you're playing a lot of notes outside of the arpeggio, but it's a similar kind of thing where you're not playing a scale. You're not playing a scale, but you're not just playing the arpeggio. And it ends up working out pretty well. 4.2 is an extreme example of this, okay? Like, I wouldn't necessarily do this, but I might. Yeah, I totally might do it. Like, it depends on what you want it to sound like. I'm going to play it slowly because I think that's about the only way I can play it for starters. But it starts like 4.1, but this is going to be, and I'm sorry, I didn't put the chord names over each measure, but what it is the first measure is a C chord, the second measure is an F chord, the third measure is a C chord, and the fourth measure is a G7 chord. So, and they're all dominant 7 chords. So we do the C. Now we're going to lead into an F chord, F7. Now we're on the third measure and we go back to a C chord, but now we're doing it up an octave into the next position, which is position 1. So we're on the third measure here. I wonder if you followed that. Did you follow that? How now we're up in position 1 of C7 there. So hopefully you followed that. And then we end on this G7, which I didn't do the same thing. I did more of a pattern coming down. So the whole, and maybe the most confusing part is when I switched to the F7, because then I kind of almost switched to key. You know, I'm now in a different position. I'm in position 4 of the F7 arpeggio. I'm in this F7 arpeggio, which outlines this bar chord. If it's confusing, don't worry. Like, it's okay. It's kind of confusing stuff. It all takes practice, and this is very much a matter of looking at these individually as arpeggios instead of looking at them all in the key of C. I hope that kind of makes sense. Like, in that second measure, we're not going, oh, this is a different chord in the key of C. We're going, okay, this is an F7 chord. Doesn't matter what key it's in. Like, doesn't matter. It's an F7 chord, so we're playing an F7 arpeggio. And I'm not saying that the other way of thinking it is wrong. I'm saying that's the way I'm thinking about this F7 arpeggio here. So I'll do the whole thing. I'll do it again, and I'm gonna say the chords this time, and I'm gonna do it slowly. So starting from the top, C7. Now leading into the F7. Now we're on that flat third of the C. That happens to be the 7th note of the F. Now we're gonna go into that third of the C chord. Now the G7. Folks, we have 7 minutes left of this lesson, and I want to know if y'all have any questions. If you don't, it's perfectly fine, but I understand if this stuff is confusing, and some of these riffs might need to be saved for a later lesson, which is okay. Just let me know, though, or let Chris know, and he will relay them to me. I'm going to keep going, and we're going to take a look at 5.1. Now, this riff is going to look easier than the last couple riffs, but it's more of a concept than anything else. And the concept is the target tones and the leading tones, and outlining the note of the next chord that you want to hit. So I'm going to go ahead and play this riff. This is 5.1. Sorry. What I'm doing, the key part of this riff is actually at the beginning of the second measure, where I go, it's really all a C7 arpeggio. But what I'm doing, I'm hitting the 4th of the scale, up to the 5th of the scale, down to the flat 3rd, and I'm going like that. Do you see how that third is right in the middle there? Like, that's the note that we're really, really bringing out in that second measure. Like, that's the one that's very, very important. That's the whole concept of this figure 5 here. So the riff is fine. It's a fine riff if you want to learn it. It's pretty easy. It's in that position 1, that one that I said we probably use quite a bit. And it's right there, but the big key is outlining that third, or targeting it, playing a note above, playing a note below, that kind of thing. If you end up kind of like making your own target tone riffs, a lot of people will like to say that you should play if you're going to target a tone. Like let's say we want to target, for example, the flat 7. They'll say play a scale tone above the note, play a chromatic tone below the note. Both of those happen to be scale tones. So it's the root note and the 6 and then land on the flat 7. If we take the 5th, for example, which would be a G, well, they'd say play a scale tone above, which would be the 6 above, and then the flat 5 into the 5. Because that's the chromatic tone below. That's what a lot of people say. I say do what sounds good. Do what sounds good. Try different things. And if you're not at the point of wanting to target tones like this yet, it's okay. It's kind of a jazz, kind of country sort of thing. Like, it's all right. Use what works for you in these lessons. Chris, just let me know that we're still rolling and everything, if you would. And let me know if there are any questions, but I think 5.2 here might be my last one for the day, and that's okay. The other two, if you want to look at them, that's fine, but we might just save them for another lesson. What 5.2 is going to do is we're going to, we've got a C chord for a measure and F chord for a measure, and we're talking C7, F7, back to C7, back to F7. Take a look at the last 2 notes of each measure. The last 2 notes of each measure are going to surround, I should say, the target tone that starts the next measure, okay? So I'm gonna do this slowly. We're in position 5 for C7, and we go. And what we're doing there, we're surrounding this note of the F7 chord. That first note of the second measure, that's the 3rd of the F7 arpeggio. And that's what we're doing. So from the top. Do you hear how we're doing that? The important part is these last 2 notes of the first measure. You see how they surround that note of the F7 chord? Then we're going to do the same thing here, going back to the C chord. And we surround that flat 7 of the C chord. And then we're going to do the same thing with the root note of the F7 chord. So hopefully that makes a little bit of sense there. What we're talking about is targeting the tones of the chords. But I'll go ahead and play that 5.2 all the way through one more time. So check that out. Folks, we have reached the end of the lesson today. This has been a lot of fun for me. Hopefully it's been a lot of fun for you as well. I really enjoyed doing this. I really, really love getting to share guitar with people. This has been my big passion for over half my life. So this is a lot of fun. We'll get to those other riffs in another lesson, but thanks a lot for tuning in, and I'll hope to see you next week. Y'all take care.